But most importantly, it is dealing with the issue of whether or not we are hearing the pain that is out there and we are responding to it. During the last year, as everybody knows, over 500,000 Americans have died of COVID and millions more have been made ill. Unbelievable. Unbelievable what we have gone through in terms of this terrible pandemic. COVID has not only caused massive death and illness, it has resulted in a way we have never experienced: social isolation. That means all over this country, you got old people, elderly people in their homes. They can't interact with their grandchildren, with their own kids, with their friends. You got young people who want to go to school, want to socialize, want to date, want to do things that young people do, and they can't do it and have been unable to do that for the last year. And that has resulted in a very sharp increase in mental illness in this country, something, by the way, that this legislation also deals with. Many Americans, young and old and middle-aged, are now dealing with depression, anxiety disorder, addictions, seeing a growth of addictions, and even suicidal ideation. So this has been just an awful year for people in our country and, in fact, throughout the world. But this last year has not only been a public health crisis, as bad as that has been. The pandemic has led, as we all know, to a terrible economic downturn, which has resulted in millions of Americans losing their jobs and their incomes, and the shutting down of something like 1 out of 4 small businesses in this country. That's just an unbelievable number. Go to any town in America and you see their main street shuttered down. Thriving businesses no longer exist. Real unemployment in this country today is now over 10%. Further, countless Americans face the threat of eviction. We have a moratorium on evictions, which is the right thing, but there is going to be a day when that ends, and people are saying, I'm $5,000, $8,000 in debt. What happens to me when the moratorium ends? How am I going to pay my rent? Am I going to be one of the 500,000 people already sleeping out on the streets? Millions more. And we have seen this in Vermont, and I know you've probably seen it in Minnesota. It's all over this country. People lining up in their cars for food. And it is something that none of us ever dreamed. Right in my own community, Burlington, Vermont, hundreds of people lining up in their cars for food. Many of them never in a million years would have dreamed that they would be in that position. And today, the level of hunger in America is at the highest level it has been in decades. And then on top of all of that, we are in the midst of a pandemic. People are scared to death about coming down with COVID. Yet because of our dysfunctional healthcare system, we have over 90 million people who are uninsured or underinsured in the midst of a pandemic. But it's not only the public health crisis we worry about. It's not only the collapse in our economy that we got to worry about. It is what's happening to our young people, because the pandemic has created massive disruption in our educational system from child care through graduate school. The majority of our young people have seen their education disrupted, and think about all of the implications of what that means. And it is likely that hundreds of colleges in America were struggling before the pandemic will cease to exist. So you got a public health crisis, 500,000 people dead, an economic crisis, real unemployment at 10%, small businesses going out of business, an educational crisis. Meanwhile, in the midst of all of that, it is important to note that not everybody in this country is hurting. What we are seeing in the midst of massive income and wealth inequality is a moment when, in fact, that gap between the very, very rich and everybody else is growing wider. Incredibly, during this pandemic, Over 650 billionaires in America have increased their wealth by more than $1 trillion. The 50 richest people in America now own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, some 160 million people. So the bottom line here is very simple. In this moment of unprecedented crises, the United States Senate must respond to the pain of working families all across this country, and we must respond in an unprecedented way, which is what this legislation is about. Now, Madam President, I want to say a few words about some of what is in this bill. This is a 600-page bill, and I will not read it all again. I think our clerks have had enough fun reading it last night, but I do want to summarize some of what is in it. Most importantly, what the American people want is they want to get back to a normal life. They want their kids to go to school, they want to go to work, they want their businesses open. And what the American Rescue Plan does is enable us to aggressively crush this pandemic and enable the American people to return to their jobs and their schools. It will establish a national emergency program to produce the quantity of vaccines that we need and get them into the arms of our people as quickly as possible. Clearly, we are making progress in that area. More and more people are getting vaccinated, but we still have a lot of work to do, and this legislation will enable us to do that. Madam President, at a time when so many of our people are hurting, this legislation will allow us to provide $1,400 in direct payment to every working-class person in this country and to their kids. And this is on top of the $600 that we provided last month. So if you are out there and you are a family of four earning less than $150,000 or an individual earning less than $75,000, you're going to get that check for $1,400. And for that family of four, that is $5,600. Now, I know that if somebody has a whole lot of money, $5,600 ain't that much. But for a family that is struggling right now, that can't pay their rent, can't feed their kids, that $5,600 for a family of four could be the difference between desperation and dignity. Further, at a time when so many of our people are unemployed, this Budget Reconciliation Act will provide $400 a week in supplemental unemployment benefits to over 10 million Americans until the end of August. If you're unemployed right now, you're worried. Your unemployment check is your only source of income. You're worried that it's going to cease. Well, it's not. This legislation will continue that check coming until the end of August. This legislation understands that we have a child care crisis in America, and we provide the resources to provide child care to 875,000 children. And very importantly, Madam President, we don't talk about this enough. One of the absolute disgraces of our economy right now is the level of childhood poverty in America, which is one of the highest for any major country on earth. This legislation will go a long way toward cutting childhood poverty. Some studies suggest we're going to cut it in half by expanding the child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000 and $3,600 for kids under the age of 6. In other words, we are about to cut childhood poverty in half in this country. This legislation obviously deals with the horror of so many of our people facing hunger. We put in very substantial amounts of money for nutrition assistance, for working families, for kids, for the disabled and the elderly. This legislation will provide rent relief, utility assistance, and mortgage assistance to millions of tenants and homeowners who are in danger of eviction and foreclosure. This legislation will protect the pensions of many millions of workers who are in danger of seeing their retirement benefits cut by as much as 65%. Madam President, not only is this $1.9 trillion emergency COVID relief package the right thing to do from a moral perspective, it is exactly what the overwhelming majority of the American people want us to do. The American people didn't want us to give tax breaks to billionaires. The American people did not want, as the Republicans fought to do, throw 30 million people off the Affordable Care Act. The American people didn't want that, but that is what the Republicans tried to do under reconciliation. Well, we have a different idea. Yeah, we're going to use reconciliation, which only requires 51 votes. We are going to use it. Not for tax breaks for the rich, not to throw people off of health care, but to provide the help that working-class people need all across this country. Madam President, I am introducing, as I mentioned earlier, legislation and amendment today to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Because of an unfortunate and, in my view, misguided decision by the parliamentarian, this reconciliation bill does not include an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In my view, it should have. And I think the parliamentarian was dead wrong. But more importantly, it is an absurd process that we allow an unelected staffer, somebody who works for the Senate, not elected by anybody, to make a decision as to whether 30 million Americans get a pay raise or not. Now, I don't care how the parliamentarian rules, no parliamentarian should have that power. If people here want to vote against raising the minimum wage, you have that right. You want to vote for it, and I hope you do, you have that right. But we should not shuffle off that responsibility to an unelected staffer. That's wrong. The amendment which I am offering today to raise that minimum wage to $15 an hour is co-sponsored by Majority Leader Schumer, and I thank him for his strong support. Senator Patty Murray, who is the chair of the Health, Education, Labor Committee, Senator Ron Wyden, who is the chair of the Finance Committee, and many others in this chamber. In fact, this amendment is similar in many ways to the legislation that I have offered, which is co-sponsored by 38 members of the Senate. And let us not forget, this legislation was passed in the House, and I want to thank my friends and colleagues in the House Progressive Caucus for their extraordinary leadership on this issue. This amendment is supported by some 300 national organizations, including the AFL-CIO and virtually all of the major unions in our country. And I want to thank in particular the SEIU, one of the great unions in America, who have led this effort for years in terms of the fight for 15, where people working in McDonald's and Burger King have gone out on strike and said, no, we can't make it on $10 an hour, $11 an hour. And I want to thank the SEIU. And because this legislation will help workers all across the board, but it will significantly help women who are unfortunately forced into low-income work more than the general population, more than men, and it will disproportionately help African Americans and Latinos who disproportionately are forced into low-income work. This legislation is supported not only by 300 organizations, but by groups like the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. They understand that if we're going to improve the standard of living of the African American community, we got to raise that minimum wage. It is supported by the National Organization for Women, because again, this raising the minimum wage is a women's issue in a very significant way. Not totally, believe me. A lot of men out there who are working for $9, $10, $11 an hour, but disproportionately it impacts women. It is supported by UNIDOS and other Latino organizations, supported by the American Association of University Women, supported by Indivisible, Justice for Migrant Women, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the National Women's Law Center. And here is the simple truth, and that is that in the richest country in the history of the world, we can no longer tolerate millions of our workers being unable to feed their families because they are working for starvation wages. And that is not what I say, although I do say it. It's what the President of the United States says, who very, very strongly supports raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and I thank him for his support. You know, when we look at the economy, people look at the stock market, they look at a whole lot of indices out there. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what is going on in the lives of ordinary people? And it is not acceptable to me that half of our people live in paycheck to paycheck, and millions of people are trying to get by on $9, $10, $11 an hour. And you know what? You can't do that. You can't do that in Vermont, and you can't do it in California, you can't do it in Minnesota. You can't do that. And our job is to make sure that we have an economy that works for all and not just the few, and that in order to do that, we are going to have to raise that minimum wage to $15 an hour. Frankly, it is disgraceful that Congress has not passed an increase in the minimum wage since 2007. Think of all the things that have transpired since then, but Congress has not raised the minimum wage since 2007. And the reality is that the minimum wage has lost over 30% of its purchasing power since 1968. Minimum wage is worth a lot less now than it used to be. When we increase the minimum wage, Madam President, we will be giving over 32 million Americans a much-needed pay raise. And let's be clear, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour is an enormously popular idea. More than 60% of the American people in poll after poll support raising the minimum wage. Since 1998, this is really amazing. And I have some friends here who are nervous. Oh, my goodness, how radical can it be? Should we raise the minimum wage? Oh, my God, I'm scared of the American Restaurant Association. Well, since 1998, every time a state has had an initiative on the ballot to raise the minimum wage, it has won. In conservative states and progressive states. Put it on the ballot, it wins. Just as one example, in November, just this last November, election time, Joe Biden lost Florida. Donald Trump won Florida by 3 points. But in that same election, the people of Florida, and I say that to the two senators from Florida, 61% of the people in Florida voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Florida voted for Donald Trump and voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. 8 states over the years, 8 states and over 40 cities have adopted laws to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It's not a radical idea. And as you know, over just a few days ago, the House of Representatives did the right thing and voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. This is not a radical idea. People want it. States have done it. The House of Representatives have done it. And now it is our turn to do what the American people want. Now, in the last few days, I have heard some concerns from my colleagues about one part of our amendment, and that is the provision to raise the tip wage, which now stands, I want everybody to hear that, tip wage for waiters and waitresses and all those people who get tips, now stands at $2.13 an hour. No, you did not mishear me. $2.13 an hour. And that is the federal minimum wage for waiters and waitresses, for barbers, for hairstylists, for parking attendants, and others. And that tip minimum wage has not been raised since 1991, 30 years ago. You think maybe it's time to raise the tip wage from $2.13 an hour past 30 years ago? I think so. The proposal in this legislation would raise that tip wage from $2.13 an hour to $14.95 over a 7-year period. Now, time and again, our legislation gets misrepresented. People say, oh, you're raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour tomorrow. No, we are not. Tip wage is going to take 7 years. For better or worse, that's what it is. Now, the National Restaurant Association, a very powerful lobbying organization, has suggested to members of Congress that this legislation is opposed by restaurant workers and would be harmful to their interests. This is not true. One Fair Wage, an organization representing service employees, has just delivered to the White House a petition with 140,000 signatures from service workers who are demanding that they receive the same minimum wage as every other worker in their state. Polling among service employees and non-service employees also supports the reality that Americans want our waiters and waitresses and other service employees to get a fair minimum wage. Now, I have heard from some people that those people who are working in the service industry are doing really well, and they don't want an increase in the federal minimum wage. The tips that they are receiving are covering all of their needs. Leave well enough alone, they say. Well, today, 70% of tip workers are women who suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce. They are not doing so well. They use food stamps at double the rate of the general workforce and suffer, by the way, from the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry because they must tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to get the incomes that they need. Further, and this is important, and I want all of my colleagues to hear this, the idea of moving tip wages to the same level as the overall minimum wage is not a radical idea. It has been done in state after state. It already exists in 7 states in our country, including California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Montana, Alaska, and Minnesota. And I should point out that all of those states experienced a growth in the number of small businesses and restaurants after they abolished the tip minimum wage. And guess what? Waiters and waitresses in these states receive more tips, not less. And let's be clear, this pandemic has made a bad situation worse for waiters and waitresses. So right now, Madam President, it is absolutely imperative that we raise that minimum wage to a living wage for all of our workers, and that we raise the tip wage as well, which is already law in 7 states of the country right now. And I see the Senator from California, Mr. Padilla, and we're delighted that he is joining us. And his state has been one of the leaders in this country in raising the minimum wage, and I would yield the floor to him for his remarks.
Madam President.
Senator from California.
Madam President, I rise today in support of working men and women across the country. And I'm proud to stand with Senator Sanders, who has been a champion for working people. Let me be clear. Raising the minimum wage is COVID relief. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the immense underlying inequities in our nation. It has also driven home how important essential workers are to our society and to our economy. Millions of Americans do essential work, but are not paid a living wage. They work as home health aides, assisting elderly family members meet their basic needs with dignity. They produce our food, stock our grocery shelves, keep facilities clean and safe, care for our children, and so much more so that we can go to work. They're on the front lines of this pandemic, risking their health, yet still struggling to keep themselves and their families healthy. They shouldn't also have to struggle to keep a roof over their heads and food on their table. Both of my parents worked jobs that are considered essential today. For 40 years, my father worked as a short order cook. For the same 40 years, my mom was a domestic worker. And it's people like them all over America who work hard with dignity, yet still struggle to make ends meet. That is not the American dream. Far from it. It's finally time that Congress does something about it. There is strong bipartisan support throughout the country for raising the minimum wage. I'm proud to say that my home state of California has been a leader in the fight for 15. And just this past year, the voters of Florida, yes, Florida, the state that voted for Donald Trump not once but twice, approved a $15 minimum wage by a 20-point margin. That's because it is Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, who know that one of the most straightforward ways we can help working people is by raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now, California is a big state. We're a very diverse state, full of diverse communities with local variations in cost of living and local business conditions, just like the rest of the country. And let me tell you, the sky did not fall when California enacted a $15 minimum wage. Now, I know some of our colleagues have argued that raising the federal minimum wage would reduce employment opportunities for American workers. The facts show otherwise. 40 years of studies have found little to no significant impact of wage increases on employment levels. Some of our colleagues have also argued that eliminating the tipped minimum wage nationwide would harm earnings for workers. That also has not happened. Again, research has found that eliminating the tipped minimum wage has no significant impact on employment. At the same time, median hourly wages for tipped workers are higher in equal treatment states like California compared to those with a tipped minimum wage. Madam President, 1.7 million Americans make the federal minimum wage. That's a $15,000 a year income. We must be honest with ourselves. No one can meet the minimum standard of living on a minimum wage of just $15,000 a year. Now, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would also help reduce some of the gender and racial inequities in our nation, as Senator Sanders has referenced, given the overrepresentation of women and minorities in jobs that earn the minimum wage. And it would give them more money to spend in their local economies, which in turn is good for business. But most importantly, it will lift hundreds of thousands of families out of poverty. Think about that. We have the opportunity to lift hundreds of thousands of families out of poverty. This isn't just an opportunity, it is a moral responsibility. No one who works a full-time job should live in poverty. It's that simple. We must stand on the side of hard-working Americans. I call on my colleagues to continue the fight for 15 and pass the Sanders Amendment to bring justice and prosperity for all American workers. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Oregon.
Madam President, right now the Senate is debating, having been started by our colleague Senator Sanders, whether it is okay to pay starvation wages in the United States. You heard that right. Starvation wages. Receiving that starvation wage, single moms are skipping meals as they try to make rent and buy groceries for their family. These moms get paid $7.25 an hour, often work 2 jobs, and go to bed every night, worried that the next morning is going to bring financial calamity. Senators, is this okay in a country as rich and strong as ours? Here in the United States Senate, nobody's got to worry where their next meal is coming from, but that's an everyday struggle for too many families across the land. Senators, let us think about those who are hurting as the vote on the Sanders minimum wage amendment approaches. It is time for that single mom to get a fair wage for a fair day's work. A living wage, not a starvation wage. There has never been a stronger case for a $15 minimum wage than there is right now during the pandemic. I think about grocery store and pharmacy workers, home health aides, food processing and packing workers, restaurant employees interacting with maskless customers. So many workers in Oregon and across the country are going to work in a dangerous environment each day. Many of them are Black and Latino workers, people from the communities that have suffered the most from COVID-19. They've kept our country going through the last year. I've heard a whole lot of members of the Senate, Democratic and Republican, talk about those workers as heroes of the pandemic. So the question is, will the Senate stand up and give those heroes of the pandemic the raise they deserve, the raise they've waited for 12 years? There are 30 million Americans who earn less than $15 an hour. It would be closer to 40 million if not for the fact that the coronavirus put so many Americans out of work. That is just immoral and unacceptable. Now, if you want to see inequality baked into the law, just look at how the country treats its lowest income workers compared to those at the top. The minimum wage has been stuck for 12 long years, and a flat minimum is nothing but a slow-moving pay cut for those who make the least. A minimum wage worker cannot afford the average rent in any state in America, not one that doesn't account for utilities and food and gas and car payments and medical bills, school supplies. Here's the fact. Living is expensive for the poor in America. Meanwhile, the most well-to-do keep winning with their investments in the stock market. The entire tax code is rigged to favor the income of billionaires over the income of wage-earning families. Republicans passed a $2 trillion Trump tax law promising trickle-down benefits. Been talking about that for decades, even though those magical benefits never actually trickled down. The Trump administration actually made it A-OK in the eyes of the law for corporations to steal from their employees' tipped wages. A country that aspires to be pro-work should not be this anti-worker. Members of the Senate might forget it now, but the minimum wage used to go up all the time. Happened 22 times since the minimum wage was enacted in 1938. Through the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, the post-war period that many look at the boom years of the 20th century, the minimum wage went up all the time, and Congress expanded the range of workers it covered. Now, colleagues, these increases did not lead to the end of Western civilization back then, and raising the minimum wage isn't going to do it today either. That's because, and folks might want to sit down when I say this, it's good for everybody when there are fewer poor people in America. This is the longest the Congress has gone without raising the minimum wage since its origin. In recent years, the grassroots movement has picked up the slack and made a lot of progress in cities and states all over the country, including my home state of Oregon. But the Congress cannot wait any longer. The powerful can pull the levers around here in a hurry, and they get more than their share of benefits and attention. Right now, the Congress has a chance to actually prove that it's looking after working people, and that means raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Every single senator says they want to incentivize hard work. And folks, a living wage does just that. The single mom skipping meals to feed her kids deserves better. The Senate can do better starting today. I appreciate my colleague, Senator Sanders, leading the effort to raise the wage for years and years. As the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, I am all in with Senator Sanders on this fight. Senators, support our amendment, give tens of millions of America's hardworking people a raise. And before I yield the floor, I just briefly want to provide an update with respect to the issue of trying to make sure that folks who have been laid off from their job through no fault of their own are going to be able to get an unemployment benefit where they can make rent and pay groceries. We're having conversations now, bringing people together, I believe, around two core principles. One is avoiding a cliff in August where you would have something like 11 million people lose their benefits. We've got to do that. It defies common sense to have a cliff in the middle of August when you've got the Senate out of session. And second, we're making a lot of progress on preventing an unemployment tax surprise. This is a matter Senator Sanders and I have spoken about at length for weeks. A number of colleagues on both sides of the aisle have a great interest in this. I think we've made a lot of headway. We'll have more to discuss with the Senate, but I'm really hopeful that this can bring all sides of this debate together. I have personally felt the benefit should be $400. It should certainly run into September, but I know some of my colleagues feel otherwise. So what we're looking at is making sure that we can get a benefit so that people can make rent and pay groceries, that we prevent that cliff. And by God, we sure as hell shouldn't let folks who are unemployed pay taxes on those unemployment benefits that they secured in 2020. Senator Sanders and I will continue to prosecute this question of tax forgiveness very strongly as well. I appreciate his leadership. I see Senator Murray, the chair of another important committee with jurisdiction over this matter. And, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to really thank Senators Schumer, Senator Wyden, and Senator Sanders and others for working so hard with me on making sure that our relief bill includes a much-needed raise for our workers. Democrats and Republicans alike have joined together in rightly calling our essential workers heroes and the backbone of our economy. But despite their tireless work and the constant risk of COVID exposure, too many of these workers are paid wages so low they cannot afford to pay for even their most basic needs. This pandemic should be a wake-up call that these workers, who we all call heroes, deserve more than $7.25 an hour. I urge my colleagues to vote for the Sanders Amendment in order to give a much-needed raise to millions of workers and end the tipped minimum wage and sub-minimum wage for youth workers and workers with disabilities. After more than a decade since the last federal minimum wage increase, the tides are turning, and there is overwhelming support for Congress to act. So let me be clear, today's vote is just one step in our fight. We are not going to give up. And today we're going to keep working to get this historic bill across the finish line. Because right now, Mr. President, this country is on fire. And Republicans' biggest concern seems to be that we might use too much water. The reality is we are far from doing too much because we will not have done enough until this crisis is over, until families across the nation are safe, and until we rebuild a stronger and fairer country. Anyone who says this bill is too expensive needs to understand how much this pandemic has already cost our communities, how much it has already taken from families, and how much more is at stake if we don't finally bring it to an end. They need to listen to public health and healthcare workers who have been straining to test, to contact trace, to vaccinate people across the country, and to grapple with the trauma of fighting this pandemic on the front lines. They need to listen to parents who are asking how they are supposed to go to work when they don't have childcare and their kids can't go to school in person, wondering how they're going to pay rent, how they're going to pay for groceries, how they're going to pay to keep the heat on, and fearing what will happen if they cannot. They need to listen to students who this pandemic has robbed of critical school resources as well as opportunities to grow and thrive and socialize with their peers. They need to listen to our states and our cities and our tribes and our territories who have seen their budgets upended. And they absolutely need to listen to people of color, to voices in the Black, Latino, and tribal communities who have been hit the hardest by this pandemic in every way. Because anyone who has been listening to the American people, anyone who has been watching what they have gone through, understands the danger in this moment is not doing too much, it is doing too little. If Republicans want to talk about too much, there are almost 10 million fewer people working compared to this time a year ago. 11 million people at risk of eviction, and 11 million people about to lose their unemployment benefits. That's too much. One study says by June, this pandemic will likely have set students back 5 to 9 months in math from where they could be in a typical year. And that setback is even larger for students of color. Another notes that schools across the country have shifted to remote learning that 1 in 4 students lack access to internet at home. And according to the CDC, 1 in 4 young adults has considered suicide. That's too much. Since the start of the pandemic, we have lost over 650,000 jobs in higher education and 1 in 6 jobs in childcare. That's too much. Across this country, this virus has infected over 28 million, left thousands of long haulers still experiencing symptoms, and killed over 500,000 people. That is too much. We have to act, Mr. President. We have to, and that's why we are fighting to pass the American Rescue Plan. This American Rescue Plan will send families long overdue direct relief and prevent expanded unemployment benefits that have been a lifeline to so many people from expiring. It will help get vaccines in arms faster. It will hire and train more public health workers. It will ramp up our testing capacity and invest in programs to counter the disproportionate harm COVID-19 has caused, specifically to communities of color and tribes. It will expand affordable insurance to more families and give schools much-needed resources to help our students get back to classrooms for in-person learning safely. And it will stabilize our struggling childcare sector, which is so critical to helping women and working families get back to work. It will support small businesses and help states keep educators and firefighters and sanitation workers and others on the job. So before my Republican colleagues worry any more about the cost of doing all that, I hope they take a moment to consider the staggering cost of failing to do it. There is a reason bold action like this plan has the support of Republican governors like Jim Justice in West Virginia, the support of Republican mayors like Betsy Price in Fort Worth, Texas, or Francis Suarez in Miami, Florida, or David Holt from Oklahoma City. And according to a recent poll, the support of a majority of Republicans. That same poll showed the American people support this package by an overwhelming 3-to-1 margin. People support this American Rescue Plan because the American Rescue Plan supports people, workers, families, communities who know firsthand the loss and hardship of this last year. And because they understand the simple fact that when the house is in flames, you do not argue about how much of the fire to put out, or how much water to use, or how many lives to save. You do whatever it takes until the crisis is over and everyone is safe, and you do it as fast as you can. That's what Democrats are trying to do today. That's what this bill is about. And I urge every single member of the Senate to support it. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to talk about the American Rescue Plan, but following my colleague from Washington and in the presence of the senator from Vermont, I just want to thank them for how hard they have fought for an increase in the minimum wage. Our state, the state of Washington, has led the nation for many years in the highest minimum wage, and it didn't impact our economy. In fact, it helped our economy. There are now reports, as we have moved towards 15 from just a little town, SeaTac, to the city of Seattle, to now a plan for our entire state to move to 15 over a gradual period of time. I urge my colleagues to come together with a plan that can get us to a $15 minimum wage. I know that we have it in us. I know that we can do it, and I so appreciate our colleagues waging this effort to continue to make this a priority for our nation. I can't tell you enough how much the wages, particularly in a place like Seattle, are going to matter to people to have a livable wage. I know people here have discussed various aspects of this program and the plans that are in this bill, but I just want them to know that the cost of living in a very expensive place like Seattle demands that we pay workers what they deserve. It also means that we deal with big city problems like homelessness and deal with making investments, and I hope that our next infrastructure bill will get to that. So this is not the last time I'm going to speak about minimum wage, but I want our colleagues to know that this battle is not over yet, and that if we want to raise the standard of living in the United States, we have to pay a livable wage. So, Mr. President, I come to talk about the details of the rescue plan. This is 1 year since a young man from Everett, Washington became the first COVID victim in the United States of America. Not only did he get sick, but many loved ones got sick, their families, and they're all waiting now for vaccines. So this legislation, priority number one for so many Americans right now, is the COVID-19 vaccine. In my state, the state of Washington, more than 1 million residents have been vaccinated and 6 million more are still waiting, and everyone knows that demand far exceeds the supply. Our healthcare workers are working tirelessly along with other government officials to get shots in the arms of individuals. That's why this bill is so important, because it provides $20 billion to invest in vaccine administration and distribution. That includes launching community vaccine centers, deploying mobile vaccine units to hard-to-reach areas, and continuing to support an increased pace of vaccinations. That is job one right now, get the vaccine into the arms of Americans. So that is why this legislation is so important, to continue that effort. But it also provides other support, extending unemployment benefits for millions of Americans who lost their job as to no fault of their own a year ago and now are seeing unemployment benefits expire next week. We know what today's numbers say. We still have a very high unemployment rate in the United States of America. So this bill extends the benefits another 5 months until August 29th. Very prudent measure to continue to put the resources into the American economy. It also provides $1,400 stimulus payment to millions, and it supports new efforts for our restaurants, small businesses, and those devastated by the pandemic, so they can help use this money for payroll, rent, utilities, and paid sick leave. This is so important to continue to learn from the programs that COVID has started, to refine them, to make it successful for our economy. This also helps children who are at home, provide more money for E-rate and broadband connectivities for schools and libraries. This is so important to individuals. It also provides critical dollars for federal health funding to treat Native Americans in urban areas, a community that has been very hard hit by the pandemic. Our economy lost 9.8 million jobs in 2020, and our current unemployment rate, as I just said, we know from this data that came out this morning, is still too high. We know that as a result, 19 million Americans, including 460,000 Washingtonians, rely on those unemployment benefits. And if we don't act by March 14th, 11.5 million people will lose their extended unemployment benefits. So that's why this program is so important to get passed today in the United States Senate. So the restaurants, as we know, have been very plagued by this problem, and the PPP program has been helpful, but I believe this legislation will be even more helpful. Since the beginning of the pandemic, 110,000 restaurants across our country have closed, either permanently or for an extended period of time, including 2,300 in the state of Washington. And some are just struggling to hang on. For example, Black Cypress Restaurant in Pullman, Washington lost more than $1 million in revenue and had to lay off workers after the initial PPP loan program ran out. In Southwest Washington, a restaurant like Mighty Bowl in Vancouver or the Depot Restaurant in Seaview are operating at 50% revenue loss. I talked to one of our restaurant owners, Wasif Haroon, who operates very popular restaurants in Seattle, including Mamnoon. He said his restaurants have lost 70% of their revenue compared to 2019. And these are people who are hustling to do stand-up, pop-up windows and all sorts of things to keep the restaurants and restaurant employment working. So the Paycheck Protection Program was critical, and these improvements were desperately needed. So that is why this bill includes new $25 billion grant programs for restaurants to address those concerns of rent and utilities and sick leave and other things head on. The bill also helps with more funding for the SBA Live Venues grant program that we have authorized and helping those venues stay open. For us in Seattle, music is a thing, and we want these venues to be there. They're part of our history, they're part of our culture, they're part of a music story that really is about well, just a little bit of different take on music than maybe some other parts of the world. So we're very proud of it, and we don't want to lose these facilities, the home for growing more music and cultural impacts to our society. So one of the hardest hit, though, businesses have been businesses with 10 or fewer employees in underserved areas like Grays Harbor or Yakima or Ferry County or Pend Oreille. This legislation allows $10,000 grants from the SBA program of Economic Injury and Disaster Loan Program to help with these smaller communities and the small businesses who've been underserved to date on programs that we have passed. But first time in this legislation will be support for the aviation supply chain. We're hearing all sorts of discussions about supply chain shortages and the competitiveness of the United States if the United States sees critical supply chain elements not be able to be filled, whether you're talking about the automotive industry or whether you're talking about aviation. Well, in the previous bills, certainly I can say this, the Fed made capital available that certainly manufacturers, large-scale manufacturers took advantage of. Previous bills made money available for the airlines to continue operating, as this legislation does as well. And I would say I think we're probably somewhere between 40 to 45% of the original capacity for airlines that we were previous to the pandemic, which means we're making progress. And that's what we always wanted to see, the ability to return our economy quickly. But in Washington State alone, we have 30,000 aerospace manufacturers and supply chain jobs that have been lost. Our aerospace supply chain is part of a juggernaut for our economy. It helps us with our gross domestic product, and it helps us in containing and keeping a workforce that is skilled, that can work post-pandemic. So in this legislation, we will be, for the first time, making resources available for that supply chain. I want to thank Senators Moran and Senator Warner and a slew of other members who worked on providing resources to this supply chain. It will help us retain and rehire workers in the aviation manufacturing sector. It will help us keep highly skilled workers who serve as the backbone of industries so that our nation can continue to be poised for the recovery. And it helps us in making sure that we are poised for a strong recovery. We know that aviation manufacturing jobs mean a lot to our nation. Finally, we're going to help stave off the tide of the huge losses that we've seen in that sector. We're going to help the mom and pop machine shops. We're going to take those who have been working on small aircraft parts and landing gears and doors and flight controls, all help them with the impact that they have felt in trying to keep a workforce during this period of time. So, Mr. President, these are all important priorities for us as a nation: the vaccines, the unemployment benefits, the stimulus checks, the E-rate program for helping students learn at home, the investment in the aerospace supply chain. It is important that we get the dollars out the door. This will help us recover. This will help American families wage through the last months of this COVID pandemic fight. But believe me, they need the help in the last months. This fight is not over, and this will help sustain us. I urge my colleagues to pass this legislation.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Similar to Senator Cantwell, I want to talk a little bit about the small business provisions in the American Rescue Plan and the urgency of passing the Recovery Act as soon as possible. We need to act in order to deal with the recovery of COVID-19 for our nation. And as chair of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee, it's critically important to the health of small businesses that we act on the American Rescue Plan. Small businesses are critically important to our economy. I think the members of this body understand that. 2 out of every 3 jobs in the private sector is created through small companies. Innovation takes place in a much larger amount in small companies. Just look at how small companies have adjusted to COVID-19. We've seen curbside pickup. We've seen the use of the online deliveries. We've seen ways in which small businesses have shown that they can figure out ways to try to stay alive under any circumstances. But there's another factor about small businesses, and that is they're not as resilient to deal with an economic downturn as the larger companies are. So whenever we go through any type of a recession, small businesses suffer the most. So for all those reasons, it was critically important for us to act to help America's small businesses. And Democrats and Republicans worked together to create a way in which we could help small businesses during this pandemic. And it's interesting that the very first bill that we passed removed the restrictions in regards to the EIDL program so that those businesses that suffered as a result of the pandemic could qualify the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program under the Small Business Administration. We did that because we realized that government was imposing restrictions on small businesses in their operations. We had a responsibility to act. And then in mid-March of last year, not this year, mid-March of last year, we passed the CARES Act almost a year ago. It recognized that this pandemic was having a major impact on our small businesses. We didn't realize how long the pandemic would go. We thought it would last a few months. We certainly did not think it would last a full year and now beyond a year. And we passed innovative programs in order to save small businesses. And the one that got perhaps the most attention, the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, we initially provided $350 billion. I'd like to think of the CARES Act as really as a Marshall Plan. It was a Marshall Plan to deal with COVID-19. It provided the monies for vaccination, research, and for testing, and for public health, and to help our states and local governments, to help schools. But it also provided money in a major way to help small businesses. And $350 billion was initially provided through the Paycheck Protection Program because we realized that rather than having to put more money into unemployment insurance, wouldn't it be better to keep people on payroll so that small businesses can retain their essential workforce? And it worked. The program was very, very popular. But we did more than just the Paycheck Protection Program. We also expanded the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, the EIDL program, because we recognize that forgivable loans of a limited amount of money was not enough to carry businesses over during the pandemic. They're going to need longer-term loans. EIDL is a 30-year low-interest loan, up to 30 years. And we also created a new program known as the EIDL Advance Program, which was cash. It was not a loan, not a forgivable loan. It was a grant of up to $10,000 because we know for many small businesses, particularly the most stressed and the most challenged, taking on another loan was not a possibility. So we provided an EIDL advance up to $10,000. We also provided for loan forgiveness for those who had existing or recently taken out 7A or 504 loans under the Small Business Administration. These programs were exceedingly popular. So popular that within just a matter of weeks, we started running out of resources. We had appropriated, we thought, a significant amount of funds, but we found that $350 billion went pretty quickly. So we came together and we replenished the funds. We put more money into the Paycheck Protection Program. And we also recognized that we had to do more flexibility because businesses were suffering and they needed more ability to be able to use those funds. So we granted additional flexibility. Well, when we passed the CARES Act, we thought this pandemic would be over with by last summer. Well, that was not the case. So we came back together again and recognized we had to do more. We passed, as you know, this past December in the omnibus legislation, another round of help for America's small businesses. This time it was $325 billion of additional help. We provided additional eligibility for entities that had not qualified before for the Paycheck Protection Program, and we provided a second round of paycheck protection. But we targeted that second round to those small businesses that were underserved communities, minority communities, the smaller of the small businesses. We helped mission lenders, such as CDFIs and minority depository institutions, so that we could really try to reach the underserved communities. And we established a program for shuttered venues. Why? Because shuttered venues were shuttered. These are institutions that could not operate because of government order, and we recognized we had to do something special in order to deal with that. So when you put that all together, what happened? Well, we saved a lot of small businesses, and we should be proud of that record. 7 million Paycheck Protection Program loans, forgivable loans, were granted for $678 billion. 3.7 million EIDL loans were given for $200 billion. And we were oversubscribed for the EIDL advance of $20 billion. So we were able to really help, but more is needed. When we passed the omnibus bill in December, we recognized that that would hold us to March. Well, Mr. President, it's now March. We need to act to complete the work. The Trump administration, in administering the SBA programs, did things that we thought were unacceptable. They put a cap on the EIDL loan of $150,000. The statute says $2 million. Many businesses needed more help than was given by the administration of the EIDL loan program. The EIDL advance program was supposed to be up to $10,000, but the administration administered it at $1,000 per employee, making it far less desirable than Congress intended. And quite frankly, the underserved communities were not being met at the level that we had expected. And I say that because Senator Shaheen and I put a provision in the CARES Act, known now as page 30, that required the SBA to make special efforts to get to the underbanked communities, because we realized the underbanked communities were going to have difficulty getting loans that were forgivable. And their own Inspector General of the SBA said that the SBA did not carry out the intent of Congress. So we needed to do more to reach those communities that were being left behind. And that's why action is needed. And I want to compliment the Biden administration. They've taken administrative action to try to help us on this. They've opened up for 14 days exclusivity under the PPP program those businesses that are 20 employees or less. The smaller of the small businesses are those that are having the most difficulty in surviving in this climate. And they had a much more real, by executive order now have or by administrative action, they now have a much more realistic formula for the self-employed as to how much they can receive under a PPP loan. They were able to do that through executive action. And they removed the discriminatory natures against returning citizens being able to qualify for these forgivable loans. The Biden administration has taken action. Now it's necessary for us to take action. Come in with the American Rescue Plan. We need to pass it. $50 billion of additional help directly to small businesses to make the EIDL advance really work for those in low-income communities so they can get their full $10,000 grant that we intended them to receive. So that we can make that work, we need to provide another $15 billion to the EIDL Advance program, targeting it to the underserved communities. We have a program to help our restaurants. Why help the restaurants? $25 billion. Well, here's the fact. Even with the restaurants starting to come back, we are 2 million jobs less in the restaurant field since the beginning of COVID-19. 2 million jobs less. The National Restaurant Association estimates that 110,000 restaurants have either shuttered for good or shuttered today as a result of COVID-19. We need to direct help to the restaurant community. The Shutter Venue program needs additional support, so an extra $1.25 billion is provided for shuttered venues. Let me just give you one example. The Meriwether Post Pavilion, located in Howard County, Maryland. I've been there many times. Has not operated since last March. They need help. 1,000 jobs are dependent upon the Meriwether Post Pavilion. And I'm sure every one of my colleagues can mention the venues in their own states that have been shuttered as a result of COVID-19 that need that help. We provide $7.25 billion for nonprofits, expanding eligibility, and for the digital news platforms that need help. Johns Hopkins University has done a study and shown that the employment level in our nonprofit community has dropped 1 million jobs since COVID-19 occurred. We know the great work that they do, how they step up and help us, particularly during any time, but particularly during a pandemic and during a national crisis. They need help, and they should be eligible to be able to receive the help under the Small Business PPP program. This bill will provide that flexibility so they can get the help that they need. Another reason why we have to pass the American Rescue Plan. And then lastly, let me mention the community navigators. There's a modest amount of money here so that we can have people who can help those who are not as sophisticated to be able to get the help that they need through a community navigator. Oh, yes, we have the women's business centers. Yes, we have the small business development centers, but we need more help, and I think the record has shown that. And then lastly, let me say, yes, we need to pass the American Rescue Plan for the direct help to small businesses, but they also need our economy to return to some degree of normalcy. That's why the help for opening our schools, the help for state and local government, the help for families in direct payments and unemployment insurance, SNAP benefits, COBRA protection, why the vaccine distribution is so important, the Medicaid expansion, housing assistance, and I could go on and on and on. America needs the American Rescue Plan, and they need it now. Democrats worked with the Trump administration so that we could get help during that administration. Republicans need to join us in helping the
Senator from Vermont.
My colleague, the ranking member, Senator Graham, says why? $1.9 trillion, a lot of money. We've spent money over the last year. He's right. Why are we spending money? And the answer is because we are facing a series of unprecedented crises, and because the American people are reaching out to us and they're saying, we are hurting. We are in desperate condition and we need help from the federal government. That is why we are responding. 500,000 people have died in this country from COVID, and many millions more have been made ill. And what the long-term impact of those illnesses are, nobody at this point knows. But certainly no one will deny that we have a pandemic crisis. And our job is to make sure that we produce the vaccines that the American people desperately need, and that we develop an effective mechanism to get it into the arms of the American people. And the truth is, and I want to thank the President and his team, we have made progress in the last month. But we still have a long, long way to go. And to produce the vaccines, to hire the people who will make sure that people get those vaccines, inject people with the vaccines, it's going to take money. Everybody in this Senate, and I assume in the country, wants our kids to get back to school. Well, you just can't open the schools unless they are safe. Parents are not going to send their kids back to those schools. Teachers are not going to teach. Child care workers are not going to provide the care that the little ones need. And you know what? To make those schoolrooms and school buildings safe is going to require resources. But for the sake of our children, we need to reopen the schools as quickly as possible and do it in a safe way. There is money in this bill, Senator Graham didn't mention it, to make sure that this coming summer, school districts all over this country have the resources to provide strong, well-staffed summer programs so kids who have missed significant amounts of school can make up some of what they have lost, in addition to getting some recreation and associating with their fellow young people in a way that is safe. You know, Mr. President, there was a poll that came out just last week. It was rather shocking at what it said. And it said that 63% of the American people are living paycheck to paycheck. And Senator Graham says, why are we spending all of this money? And the answer is, we don't believe that children in America should go hungry. We don't believe that working people should be evicted from their apartments or lose their homes. We don't believe that in the midst of a pandemic, people should not be able to afford to go to a doctor. So making sure that people have those direct payments, yeah, we believe in that. We believe that if a family is struggling today through no fault of their own, having lost their income, yeah, we are going to get them a check for $1,400 and a family of four a check for $5,600. You know, there are a lot of people in this country who are doing very well. And they're wondering, you know, what's this big deal about $1,400? That's not a lot of money. You know, you go to a corporate lunch, a bunch of people come there, they can spend $1,400 on a lunch. But if you're struggling to put food on the table for your kids, that $5,600 for a family of four is life and death. It is dignity or desperation. People are wondering, how am I going to pay the rent that I owe after the rent moratorium, the eviction moratorium expires? How am I going to feed my kids? How am I going to take care of the basic necessities of life? So yes, we are providing $1,400 per working class family because that is desperately needed. So when the senator says, well, why are we spending all of this money? The answer is because we are living in the most difficult moment in the modern history of this country, and arguably even a more difficult moment than the Great Depression of the 1930s. People are hurting, and in a democratic society, government is supposed to respond to the people who sent us here. Now, I know that there is controversy, and Senator Graham raised this issue. Democrats have a majority, a bare majority with the vice president, 51 votes. Why are we not working with our Republican colleagues? We have reached out time and time and time again. The president has reached out. Work with us. But you got to understand the severity of the crisis. And they have not done this. Using reconciliation, by the way, Mr. President, as you well know, not a new idea. When our Republican colleagues had the majority, they used reconciliation. What did they use it for? They used it for massive tax breaks for the rich. That's what they used reconciliation for. They used reconciliation in order to try to throw 32 million Americans off the Affordable Care Act, something that Trump was fervent about. And by one vote, Senator McCain, we prevented 32 million people from losing their health insurance through the reconciliation process. So our response is, you want unity? Well, you know what? We probably have more unity today in America around this package than anything that I can remember. Polls vary, 65, 70% of the American people understand the crisis we are facing. They want us to respond. This legislation is enormously popular, not just from progressives, not from moderates, but from Republicans as well, depending on the poll, 40, 50% more Republicans support it because they can't afford to pay their rent. They can't afford to go to the doctor. They understand that government has got to help. So the real question here, and President Biden has raised this issue, is we believe in unity. We believe in bringing people together. How does it happen that when 40, 50% of Republicans support this legislation, we can't get one vote from Republicans here? What's going on? And the answer is, I'm afraid that my Republican colleagues have moved so far to the right that they have lost contact with the needs of working families. So, Mr. President, as I said earlier, this legislation is not just about dealing with the pandemic and health care. It's not just dealing with the severe economic downturn that we are facing. It's not just dealing with the disruption of education in America and so much more. It's not just dealing with the worst moment in the modern history of this country. This amendment, this legislation, has everything to do with restoring the confidence of the American people in democracy and in their government. And if we can't respond to the pain of working families today, we don't deserve to be here. So Senator Graham said it's going to be a long night. Bring it on. We're ready. But at the end of the day, we are going to do what the American people want, what the American people need. We're going to pass the American Rescue Plan. And with that, Mr. President,
Senator from South Carolina.
The Republicans yield back their time.
Time is yielded back.
I yield back. I yield back my time as well.
All time is yielded back.
Mr. President?
Senator from South Carolina.
The budgetary effects of the pending Amendment 891 offered by Senator Sanders are merely incidental to the non-budgetary budgetary effects of the amendment. Accordingly, the amendment is extraneous. Therefore, I raise a point of order against this measure pursuant to Section 313B1D of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974.
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
in accordance with Section 904 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 and the waiver provisions of all applicable budget resolutions, I move to waive all applicable sections of that act and applicable budget resolutions for purposes of Amendment Number 972, and I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The question is on the motion to waive. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Durbin, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, and Smith. Senators voting in the negative: Graham, Haggerty, and Romney. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan. Aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young. No. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn. No. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester. No. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall. No. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer. No. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. No. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford. No. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds. No. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito. No. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst. No. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen. No. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. No. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. No. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines. No. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. No. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly. Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida. No. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun. No. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul. No. Ms. Sinema, Ms. Sinema. No. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Lummis, Ms. Lummis. No. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Grassley, Mr. Grassley. No. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman. No. Mr. Burr, Mr. Burr. No. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane. Aye. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey. No. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. No. Mrs. Murray, Mrs. Murray. Aye. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Brasso. No. Mr. Carper, Mr. Carper. No. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons. No. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inhofe. No. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven. No. Mr. Thune, Mr. Thune. No. Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cassidy. No. Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wicker. No. Ms. Warren, Ms. Warren. Aye. Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell. Aye.
What's your tally?
Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner. Aye. Mr. Casey, Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Risch, Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Shelby, Mr. Shelby. No. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tillis. No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. No. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio. No. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye.
It was just like.
Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. Aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye.